I'm pretty sure everyone in this room would have felt lonely at some point or another. I won't get a show of hands, but I know I certainly have. And the interesting thing with loneliness is, so it's very universal and human, but it can also be damaging to health. And unlike something like depression and sadness, I don't think we have the language to denote when it's a normal experience and when it's really bad for your health. There's sadness and depression. There's just loneliness, I think. Anyways, we'll get into all of that. But Melody, I want to start by asking you about your personal experience of loneliness and what led you to want to study this topic.
I was 22 when I first left my home country in China. I moved to San Diego, Southern California, a very loud place that is extremely good for extroverts. And I come from the culture where, it's so much about, introspection. It's about, listen and think before you speak. It's about being humble. It's about academic achievement. And I did feel that I was a bit out of place when I first arrived. And it took me a long time to kind of try to find a way to make friends. And then the environment in the US really doesn't help in a way that you don't see people on an incidental basis. Nobody walks, and you drive from one place to another place, and then you get into your office. Everybody has their lunch in front of their desk, and it's a very isolating environment. And then I, of course, as someone who wants to socialize in an American way, as someone in their early 20s, there are lots of parties. I try to go to the parties, and I realize that I'm frozen and, standing in the corner and just looking really uncomfortable when people wanted to talk to me. And nobody really show serious interest. And when they're interested, I was like, oh my gosh, I must have said something really silly. And then, after I left the party, I will be ruminating for days, like, why did I say that? I'm so socially awkward. That's why I can't make friends. Those things I'm pretty sure some of you have experienced at some stage in your life, right? But at that time, I didn't have the vocabulary what that is. It's not until probably just a couple of years ago when I dived into loneliness research, I realized that's what it is. It's this level of, almost really wanting to connect, but shut ourselves and shine a spotlight over our head. It's like wherever I go, I'm putting myself under the microscope and really trying to analyze every clue from other people's facial expression to their voices, and kind of becoming a reinforcing cycle in a way. Oh, that person just frowned. It must be what I said.
Right.
So that is like a really kind of anecdotal experience of loneliness. And it's actually quite a typical symptoms that we experience, because we often see loneliness come from a place of desire. It comes from a place of wanting to connect. But then it often makes us feel that we're so critical of our social interactions that we find evidence to prove that we're not good at connecting with people. So it's like this very paradoxical place. And that was my experience. And it took me a long time to get out of that. And eventually I found my crowd. I found, adopted American families. I had, became the happy stories at the end. But yeah, at the beginning it was really tough.
American culture is interesting, and I'll talk to you about the differences between Australia and America in terms of loneliness in a minute. But I think maybe we should define our terms, because there's loneliness and then there's social isolation. Can you talk about what the difference is?
Yeah, I think the concepts are really important, and I think that's often what the public get confused about. So loneliness is different from being alone. It's different from being socially isolated. Loneliness is defined as this gap, this discrepancy between our desire, the social relationship, and what we have in reality. So in a way that it is kind of as I mentioned, that kind of desire, I want to have more close relationship, I want to have more friends, but I don't have that. And then that kind of defines the subjective feeling of loneliness. I have a drive to connect to people. Social isolation is more objective, and it's often, imagine people who are living in a remote communities, for example, cut out from the rest of the world. And so that is one example. But even in cities, we have people who are living alone and don't have a lot of interactions with people, either in person or virtually. So that is more social isolation. And of course, there's being alone. It's just being in a state of being by yourself. The interesting thing is the two are related, but you don't have to be socially isolated to feel lonely. And you don't have to, feel lonely to be socially isolated. So it really depends. Some people have a lot of social needs. They like 200 close friends. And when they have only 100, they think it's not good enough. But there are also people who, if I have one close friend in my life that I can confide with, I'm really happy. And I feel like I'm not lonely.
Yeah.
And just one more thing on the definition. I think it's really important to define loneliness as a universal feeling that we all experience at some stage in our life. It becomes a problem when we're feeling lonely all the time that start to impair our thinking, our doing, our sleeping. So that become more of a problem. But, for all of us, at some stage in our life, because of the circumstances, we have felt lonely kind of momentarily. Yeah.
Do we know where that line exactly is? Like, how many days of feeling lonely do you have to have before it starts to be bad to your health? Like, can we break down when it becomes really dangerous?
That's a really good question. We don't have the number for that. But if we ask people, how often do you feel lonely in the last 30 days, for example? That's a really common questionnaire. If people say often, and then that's usually a red flag for us. Because, if we just ask people to report momentarily on a Saturday night when they're by themselves, and friends are all, married or, out doing fun stuff, then they might say that I'm lonely, but the next day they will be fine.
Yeah.
So when we ask them kind of in aggregate how lonely they feel, they probably just say occasionally, and then that's fine.
And can you explain at all why loneliness is so bad for your health? Like, why does feeling lonely lead to cardiovascular issues, mental health issues? Can you just briefly talk about why?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a question that we're still exploring. So everything that I say here, it basically shows how the science is as it is. So there's a lot of epidemiological evidence, and excuse me for the jargon, which that means we use large data sets from the population. We ask people about their loneliness status and experience, and we follow them up for, say, 10, 20, 30 years. And we start to observe disease developed in some people and not in other people. So when we look at these type of data, there is quite a consistent evidence that people who tend to report chronically lonely, being lonely kind of more at the problematic level, have higher risk of earlier death, cardiovascular disease, and mental health issues. So that is what we observed. But the challenge of this kind of science is often you can't fully account for everything else going on in people's life. A common thing is when people have some health issues, they often feel lonely as a result of the health issues because they feel isolated from people. And then to fully account that in a 20, 30 years of time is really challenging. So I always tell people that it could be bidirectional, and we just have to be very honest about the current state of the evidence. So that's from the kind of big data aspect of things. But at the biological level, there has been several proposed mechanisms that have been verified either in animal studies or in human studies. So, for example, when people are feeling lonely, they might result in behaviors as at-risk behaviors as a coping mechanism. For young people, that could be drugs and alcohol. It could be, withdrawing from social lives. It could be, not eating properly and not exercising. So that could be a potential behavioral pathway. There has been evidence from both animals and humans that when people are feeling lonely, their sleep tend to be more disturbed, and long-term poor sleep quality will lead to poor health.
Right.
And then there's, also evidence about, more at the social ecological level that we know when young people, kids constantly feeling lonely and ostracized, they tend to have poor academic performance. They're less likely to have good, education and career perspective, and that will indirectly eventually lead to poor health. So there's many different mechanisms. And I think it's, still a field that is quickly developing, and I'm just really excited to be a small player in this evidence generating process.
It's really interesting what you said a moment ago about how with the data, it's not entirely clear whether it's the loneliness or circumstances around it. That made me think about one of the most lonely times of my life was in my early 20s when we had just moved to Australia. My husband was in treatment for cancer. And so we were going through that in our 20s, a time when most people aren't dealing with cancer. And that was so lonely because of the circumstances we found ourselves in. And so, yes, the loneliness was directly, related to that. Anyways, let's talk about, there's all these ideas about, we are becoming more lonely than ever. Society is becoming increasingly lonely. The World Health Organization has, labeled loneliness a problem of global concern. The U.S. Surgeon General, is talking about loneliness as a real problem. Are we lonelier than ever? Is this true?
This is a really interesting question, and it's one of my primary research interests, because as someone who is interested in data and looking at population comparison, that's one of the first places I actually went to. So the first study I did was among American older adults, and we have trend data for more than 20 years, and it came to be the opposite. So among the older Americans, they actually their loneliness experience slightly decreased. And then I went ahead and replicated that with, more international studies, including something that I haven't published yet. So it's still, confidential. But within Australia, we actually didn't see an increase in loneliness in the general population for the last 20 years. But what we did see is a huge increase in social isolation. So that fascinates me. I actually can't wrap my head around it. I think during the discussion, I would love to ask you for potential explanations, because somehow we're becoming less connected to each other in a way that we don't socialize with people as much anymore. We don't see people interact with people as much anymore. But that doesn't seem to raise alarm bell for us.
So are the headlines wrong? We're not actually lonelier than ever?
Although there is one potential exception. So I have researched on data from across the lifespan, and I think the older adults generally defined, as 60, 65 and above, they seems to be quite fine. Okay. But it's the younger people, when we have data from, more than 100 countries from around the world, and looking at the general trends of, school-age children or teens, and we did find that for most countries, we were seeing a trend of increase among younger people.
Okay, so the headlines are correct for young people.
Only for the young people so far.
And so I feel like the obvious thing to reach for there in terms of why would be social media. The pandemic, I'm sure, didn't help. Is that why?
The only way we can say that it's absolutely the explanation is that we have to design another parallel universe where, everything stays the same and there's no social media. And unfortunately, we couldn't do that. But there has been quite a lot of argumentations, based on smaller studies, arguing that, social media is potentially more detrimental to young people as compared with older people because we use social media differently. For the older populations, they tend to use social media as a way to supplement their interpersonal relationships. For young people, especially with the current generation, they use social media probably to replace their existing social interactions, which I believe is not the same as a virtual interaction with people. And I think on that note, there's also evidence from the pandemic showing that the older generations tend to benefit from social media during the pandemic, and the younger generations tend to do worse as a result.
I feel like that could be a whole other conversation about social media, but we won't go in that direction. I want to know, how does Australia compare to other parts of the world, particularly the US, in terms of how lonely people are here?
US is bad.
Yeah. In every way. I'm Canadian, so I can say it.
To do direct country-wise comparison, it's challenging because you have to have the same sampling frame to make sure that you're having the samples represent exact same population segment. and you ask the same question, the question's being interpreted the same way. And also people respond with the same level of cultural stigma in a way, so that they're less likely to lie. So we can never get that internationally. But and Australia is not part of those, multi-country routine data collections. So it is really put Australia heads on with other countries because, in Europe, there's 20 years data collections of 30 countries using the same methodology over time. Right. So it's really easy to compare within Europe, but it's much harder to compare Australia with Europe. But Australia is not doing great based on the State of Nation report for ending loneliness together. I think their conclusion is that one in 3 is lonely and 1 in 6 or 1 in 7 is severely lonely. So that's not good. But, when we look at some of the US data, it's kind of approaching half of the population. Wow. But it depends on which survey you look at. But I think in general, it's not looking good for the US. Mm-hmm. And my personal experience there really kind of resonate with that as well, because I find it much harder to make social connections with people, partly because of the way the society is built. As I mentioned, it's a very car-dependent society. So it really takes away the opportunity to have in-person interactions on incidental basis. And when I moved to Australia, I immediately find it much easier to make friends because, you see people all the time. And I also find, as a person of color, America, it always proud of being a melting pot in a way that you kind of have to trade part of your identity for acceptance. And in Australia, I feel like, I don't know, it's more like a patchwork that your identity is valued in some way. And then there are multicultural communities who, really keep their identities while being Australians at the same time. And I find that much easier, especially working in a university setting. It's very diverse. And as compared with my experience in the US, I was the only international student in my master's cohort. So,
oh, wow.
It's a very different experience. So I think both the data and anecdotally kind of put Australia in a better place than the US. And then you have to imagine, I was in the US more than 10 years ago, and it's gone worse since then because of the social polarity and political instabilities and various other issues.
Yeah.
But Australia is still way behind countries, for example, in Scandinavia. So every time when we do the country-wise comparisons, the 5 Nordic countries always come up at the top.
Right.
Somehow loneliness doesn't really seem to be.
What's going on there?
I know. It's interesting. I often have conversations. I mean, of course, there's limited things that you can pinpoint in literature. And again, you have to design a parallel universe to really find causality. But there's a lot of things that are doing it right. So in terms of inequality, in Northern European countries, they're smaller, much smaller than, the rest of Europe and here in the US. So when we're living in an environment where people more or less, have a relatively flat gradients, when you walk into... So my Scandinavian colleagues often say that, when you walk into a coffee shops, the people who are making coffees probably make similar amount of money as the person who walking with suits. Right. So it's a very different social structure. Right. And also, I think there is this kind of priority for social times and family times. And that's something that I was really impressed every time when I visit my colleague up in Scandinavia, across all these countries. I think they prioritize social relationships, and then they're not too fussed about, having to have a huge number of friends, and they like the quiet coziness.
Good lifestyle.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Yes. So that's one aspect. But at the structure level, we also need to remember that these are extremely healthy populations as well. Their health performance is always at the top in the world. And health itself correlates with loneliness. And they have better welfare structures, better social safety nets. So there's a lot of reason. People are generally less materialistic. That's how I feel in terms of what they value in life.
Right.
So I think that's a few things that I can definitely pinpoint to.
Okay. Some things for Australia to learn from Scandinavia. Okay, I have so much I want to ask, but we're running out of time. I want to talk about gender briefly.
Yeah.
Because I've had this reoccurring conversation with my girlfriends over the last couple of months where I'm the kind of person who deeply values my female friendships. Like I invest a lot in that. They're really important to me. I love my husband, but that's not enough. And so we have been talking for the last few months about how we're all in touch with our girlfriends, but our husbands and our partners are becoming increasingly isolated and don't really see their friends, don't really have deep friendships. And it's kind of becoming worse as we all get older. And I feel like that might be reflected in broader trends, but you can illuminate that.
That is a really good question, especially with an all-female audience. I think that's definitely something we can have further discussion about later on.
What's wrong with the dudes is my question.
Yeah, what's wrong with the dude? So it's really interesting because loneliness is something that we have to measure by asking people. It's not something that we can just, hook people up with machines and measure how lonely they are. So we need to ask them the questions. There are two ways of asking questions about loneliness. We can either directly ask people, like what I mentioned before, in the last 30 days, how often do you feel lonely? And you can ask these people to tell you. Or you can ask them, do you have people you feel comfortable confiding with? Do you have close friends that you rely on? Do you have, these kind of relationships that you're happy with? So that's an indirect way of measuring loneliness. When we ask men and women how lonely they are, men mostly say that they're not. So if we look at population prevalence, it's like how often you're lonely, and then men will look like they're doing much better than women.
Right.
But when we start to ask them to report on their social relationships, whether they're happy with their, emotional connections with people, they do much worse than women. So, and this is taking into account that we expect probably more stigma perceived by men to acknowledge that. So in reality, they could be doing even worse than women.
Right.
And on that note, I have done another separate study at that time. This is before I got into loneliness research. So I was interested in how marriage transition affects people's health based on the New South Wales Middle Asian older sample. And the finding was really fascinating. So when we follow people up for X amount of years, some of them get divorced in that process. So I'm interested in how their behaviors and their health changed as a result of the divorce. And men were doing much worse in terms of psychological well-being, stress, mental health, and a bunch of behavior risk factors as well. And definitely eat less healthy, and women tend to eat more healthy. So there's a bunch of things happening after a divorce. But in the literature, there's a lot of, consensus from, Western countries in general that men, after they get married, they tend to rely on the women for their social connections. And they don't invest as much in that, so that when a divorce happens, they're hit harder. And so I think that's just another piece of this evidence that we can add to our overall discussion about gender and loneliness.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, my girlfriends and I have talked about how if it wasn't for us, our partners would be seeing no one and going nowhere and not doing a whole lot. I want to know about solutions, whether at a policy level, there's really anything that can be done to address loneliness, particularly as you say, younger people are doing worse, men are doing worse. Like what can we do to try and fix this?
I think the first step is really to have more conversations within the public to really normalize the experience of loneliness and destigmatize, because we know that when there's stigma around loneliness, that makes it harder for people to connect with each other. Like, you don't want to just walk up to people and say, hey, I'm really lonely. And then, if it's in a very stigmatized environment, then other people will immediately be put off by that kind of conversation. And I think it's really important that we talk about this as a human experience. It's evolutionarily imprinted in our body because humans survive better as a social species rather than being on our own. So it is considered like an evolutionary drive in a way that, okay, I feel lonely. Now I need to reach out for friends. It's a signal. It's just like when we reach out for water, when we're thirsty, and reach out for food when we're hungry. So I think that's really important to make that clear to the general public. And I also think it's really important that we conceptualize loneliness not just as a psychological or mental health issue that you need to have, a psychotherapist to help you correct your way of thinking and that sort of thing. I think it's really important for us to think about loneliness as part of the broader definition of social connection and how we build our society to make it easier to connect with people. And I think my experience from the US has already shown that, even though that's not a scientific study, it's not done statistics on that, when a society is, car dependent, segregated, and it doesn't have the, public spaces for people to interact with each other, the third space that we're talking about, it's making it harder for you to feel that you belong to there and you're connected to people. So I think that is really important. And I think leaning on from the Scandinavian lessons, social inequality and policies about social safety nets and all that is really important as well, because that at the end of the day, loneliness is a type of social marginalization. So I think we need to do it at the societal level.
Is there anything in the data that you've seen that particularly surprises you about loneliness, from the trends with loneliness?
I think my surprise, going back to the finding, is still we're actually not doing worse. But is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is it because we're so stigmatized to acknowledge that, or we're so out of touch with our feeling that we don't know when we're lonely? Because surely if we've become more socially isolated, it needs to be translated to some level of loneliness experience.
Yeah, I did wonder about that. That's really interesting, because I was like, have we gotten better at dealing with isolation, or what's happening there?
Yeah. What I'm really worried about is that we think that the normal way of not dealing with people a lot is acceptable, so that we have less expectation to socially connect with people. Because going back to the definition of loneliness, it's that gap between your ideal social relationships and what you experience in real life. So what I'm hoping is not that our ideal social relationship has gone down so that we have a less gap to catch up, but we don't know. I really want to find out.
Yeah, okay, brilliant.